If you have a question, please use the chat function, use the Q&A function, whatever you want. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Dimitri Sandler from Arctic Wolf and Steve Racing from ASMGi. Steve, if you'd unmute and take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for sharing your time with us today. I'm really excited about the webinar today. And whoops, I just trying to get my act together here. There you go. So I'm Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGi, and joining me again today is Dimitri Sandler from Arctic Wolf. This is part 3 of a 3-part series, and Dimitri has hung in there for the whole thing, so I really appreciate that, and thank you so much for that. Dimitri, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself for the benefit of those who
Thanks, Steve. So my name is Dimitri Sandler. I am the Director of Pre-Sales Engineering for Arctic Wolf. And again, pleasure to be here for the 3rd in the installment of the webinar series. Thank you for everybody that's in attendance and has attended the prior sessions. And thanks to Steve and the ASMGi team for hosting.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. I wanted to just mention this is part 3 of a 3-part series. And, the theory, Dimitri, was the whole, total solution is a lot of material to cover. So we break it into 3 parts. And key learning for me in this is it's hard even when you break it into three smaller parts, getting through all the material. There's a lot of stuff and a lot to cover. But I wanted to make, so MDR, that was one of the topics that we chose to focus on. That was the first webinar on March 4th. And the second one was on the managed risk component, and that was on March 25th. And then today we're gonna talk specifically about cloud security, which is part of managed risk, but we're gonna focus specifically on cloud security. So I did want to make a point, because I think we actually leveraged this statistic probably in the first webinar. Every 11 seconds, a ransomware attack will happen worldwide, right? Every 11 seconds, which is a mind-boggling stat. But I thought it would be interesting to do a look back, right? So here we are, April 8th. If you went just back to the last time we spoke, the last webinar, 2 weeks, almost 110,000 ransomware attacks worldwide. It's just mind-boggling. Nearly 76,000 in the US alone. And if you go all the way back to the first webinar that we did on March 4th, 5 weeks ago, 5 weeks, 275,000 ransomware attacks worldwide, almost 190,000 in the US alone since the first discussion. It's mind-boggling when you think about it in those terms, but I thought it would be relevant to point that out. Any thoughts on that?
It's a sad statistic, but that's the world we live in, unfortunately, right? There's more and more computers, there's more and more web applications, right? The cloud, there's more and more places for somebody to try to gain access and get our money, get our information, right? I mean, it's whether it's ransomware or any other cyber attack, at the end of the day, somebody's trying to get something and benefit from it, right? It's we're unfortunately all targets at this point.
Yep. Well, we think we can help people in that, and today we're going to focus on cloud risk, which is a huge area of concern. And here's what we're going to talk about. So just we'll talk a little bit about this big movement to the cloud. Again, not novel or anything that probably all of us aren't fully aware of and participating in, right? Risks in the cloud. So new risks that are introduced in the cloud, and how do we address those? And then we'll spend a little bit of time on what exactly is cloud security posture management, and how does it help me, right? How is it going to prevent attacks? And then I think we'll spend a little bit of time in closing just recapping on the MDR MSOC Plus program and some of the other areas that we talked about earlier. So fair enough. Let's dig in with the big move to the cloud. So no mystery here. I think everybody's aware across all industries that we're making a big movement to the cloud. So I did want to share And I got this information. So Fred Scholl, who's on the call, runs the cybersecurity program at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut. Fred wrote a blog and pulled some of this data together, which I thought was really relevant to our discussion today. So I just wanted to share some of this. There are some things in here that really jump out. I think 3 points that I wanted to make. One is that this information comes from the Society for Information Management, the SIM. Every year they do an IT trend survey. It's a very credible source, right? The other, I'll say, piece of information that I think is material and relevant in this is, for the first time, cloud is number one on the investment list, right? So when you do a look back to 2020, cloud took over the number one position for the amount of dollars invested from an IT standpoint. And I think that's material. There is clearly a movement to the cloud, and COVID probably has been a catalyst in that, but I think it matters in that people are moving there, and not just moving to the cloud, they're moving there very quickly, right? So I think it's important to make that point. The other thing that I thought was interesting in this data, just the disparity, 51% versus 13 and 18% for the type of environment, right? So the multi-tenant public cloud environment is winning, and there were a lot of drivers for that, right? And we'll talk about some of them a little bit later, but I think that was really material coming out of this. Do you have anything to add to that, Dimitri?
Again, I think we're seeing more and more folks move to the cloud, and I think we've talked about this before, and we'll touch on it again. But right, it's very easy to move to the cloud. It's doing it the right way, the secure way, and making sure you stay that way. That's really the big question, the big issue.
Yep. Agreed. So let's talk specifically about some of the risks that are, I'll say, resulting from this mass migration or mass movement to the cloud. So if we dig in, I thought it would be cool to just look at the top 5 data breaches that are from the cloud, right? That are related to data that's stored in the cloud. 2017, I just want to point out, this is a little bit dated, but 2017, to me, I've kind of labeled that year. It was the year of S3 buckets, right? A lot of the public data breaches that occurred that year, just a multitude of them, 15 to 20 at least, of very large public data breaches resulted from misconfigurations of S3 buckets at Amazon. So not a good year for Amazon, in my opinion, but it hasn't really slowed down the movement to the cloud at all. But a lot of things. And so from this study, I don't want to go through all 5 of them, but there are a couple of things that I think are really important to point out. Accenture, at least 4 AWS S3 storage buckets unsecured. Now, when I think about this, the first thing I think about is Accenture is a huge consulting firm, and they know better, right? They have expertise in all these various different things, but it highlights, the velocity that we're moving to the cloud. It's so easy to miss something that somebody has to be checking, right? Somebody has to check your work. But I thought it was worth pointing that out. Even Accenture, you can have the expertise and still make a mistake, right? And Booz Allen Hamilton is another example of a very well-respected consulting firm disclosing 60,000 files, right? There's that were in an S3 bucket that had public access turned on. I mean, it's material when you think about the number of things that are happening, not just the number of things, but the types of firms who are getting caught by this thing. This example we've seen before, right? We all know who Capital One is, and we've used this example before, but again, it's a misconfiguration in a cloud environment that led to this data breach, very expensive data breach for Capital One, right? So a lot of consequences. We're all moving workloads to the cloud, and we're doing it very, very quickly. And so the point I think that I want to make is that who's checking, right? Who's checking our work, and who's validating whether we have issues that we're creating. Are we creating risk by virtue of this? You want to elaborate on that some, Dimitri?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the point that we've raised on the previous calls, right? It's not, security is no longer an issue of tools and products, right? It's an issue of operational effectiveness, right?
Yeah.
It's an operational problem. And as you point out here, right, there were monitoring products that absolutely would have and did catch the fact that there was a misconfiguration. It's not that there's nothing else that showed it was misconfigured. There's so much data for us all to look at and to understand in our overall security journey and security posture for our organizations, that, to your point, like who actually is looking through all of this and making sure everything is configured, who's looking to see if there are alerts and trying to figure out what's a real alert versus a false positive. So this is where the challenge comes in, is as we very rapidly adopt more and more cloud services and adopt moving to the cloud, there's more and more opportunity to miss something that could be very, very critical.
Yep.
So it's not that there aren't tools in Amazon in this case, right, or Azure or any cloud provider that don't allow you to set it up properly, or may even not, may not show you that it's misconfigured. It's who's actually spending the time to make sure that that's actually being done. Yep. And that's the operational problem.
Yep. Well said. Well said. I wanted to talk a little bit about the shared responsibility model. So this isn't new, and some people are more or less familiar with it, but it's very true. And I actually have a lot of clients who say, I don't need to worry about security because I'm using a cloud provider, right? Like somehow hand off responsibility for security. And that's not so. That isn't true. And so what I tell customers all the time is, you are responsible for the security of your customers' data and your data. And you are responsible for making sure that whoever, if you put it in somebody else's environment, that they're doing the right things, right? That call that third-party risk assessments and those kind of things. But there's also a responsibility for you. So even if you look at it like a SOC report from Azure, from Microsoft or Amazon or anything like that, they always have this part about user entity controls, right? This part that you're responsible for, and you have to do these things. You have to protect your password, and you have to, make sure these things aren't happening. But I thought it was material to point out that there is a customer responsibility and a cloud provider responsibility. And I think Amazon coined this phrase, and they did a really good job of it, in my opinion. They said the responsibility that the cloud provider is responsible for the security of the cloud, and the customer is responsible for the security in the cloud. So that's a interesting delineation, and I think it's very well articulated. What do you think about that?
No,
do you
absolutely.
hear this? Do you hear this from customers often, or?
Unfortunately, right? And it's for a lot of customers, cloud might be new, and security in the cloud is definitely new. And I mean, we tend to think of, hey, if I'm moving into the cloud, why would I be concerned with all of these things, right? And
Right.
so a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding of exactly where those delineations take place and the transfer of ownership takes place. But we kind of assume that the default settings in cloud are going to be least privilege.
That's right.
Right. And unfortunately, it's the opposite. By default, most things are most privileged, and we've got to lock things down versus having everything hardened and then opening it up. And I think a lot of times we see folks make the wishful thinking versus the reality. Unfortunately, it would be nice if it was
not a
the opposite.
strategy. That's the bucket I put it in.
Exactly.
Hope is not a good strategy.
It would be great if it was the other way around, but unfortunately, it's a lot easier for the cloud providers to say.
But it's a good point that you make. The making it easy, right, to move in here, and cloud providers, they don't want to make it restrictive because it would take too long, right? And they would probably get pressure from a lot of customers and that kind of thing. So,
and then it's not on them.
Yeah, and it isn't on them, right? It falls into that customer responsibility piece. You're absolutely right. So the cloud security posture management. So this is a relatively new term. Gartner has some words of wisdom about this, and I just wanted to highlight, because this I think it holds the key to a lot of like checking on configurations and those kind of things. But I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of backtracking historically about cloud security and cloud security posture management and those kind of things. So Gartner basically says, first of all, Arctic Wolf says it's continuous process monitoring, right? So you're looking at the cloud configurations continuously and looking for very specific things. And we're going to drill and get in the weeds on that a little bit later in the presentation. But Gartner says that through 2024, if you do this, if you leverage this, you will lessen security incidents by 80%. That's huge. It's absolutely huge. And the Gartner goes on to say that most attacks on cloud implementations are a result of user error, right? So but it's not just Gartner that says this. So the Wall Street Journal saying something very similar. Human error is the culprit most of the time. And I thought this really articulated it well, right? This paragraph, Teresa Walsh is the gal's name. She heads up the FS ISAC team. And so all of the big banks are members of FS ISAC and share information about security intelligence, threat intelligence, and those kind of things and breaches. 130 pages. So Amazon has 130 pages of instructions to set up their environment. That's who's reading this stuff, right? Who's going to take the time to read 130 pages? Somebody who's certified, probably, but most enterprises, they don't have time to go through this. They need it now. They want it now, and there's a lot of pressure to really perform. But Teresa says 130-page instructions for AWS. That's a problem. It's hard, right? So I along those same lines, so 130 pages of instructions, it only takes one mistake. Just miss one setting, forget to check one box or check one box that you shouldn't. Just one mistake, and you can get hurt really badly. This was pretty eye-opening for me, but I think we know it. It's obvious, right? You only have to make one mistake. But yet we take so much for granted when we do things. It's real easy to skip over something and hope for the best, right? So and Gartner chimed in this Wall Street Journal article as well, and basically said 95% of all incidents or breaches are human error. It's a huge number. So I wanted to, just in the spirit of keeping things moving, I'll just toggle to this. I wanted to just speak about complexity a little bit. And, this is an actual visibility into the management console, the security center of Microsoft Azure, right? And so you can see that Azure's finding things that are wrong, right? But in order to benefit by this, somebody has to log in and actually look at these things. And what really occurred to me is that most of the things they find are likely false positives, right? Somebody has to investigate every single alert and say, nope, this isn't a problem. Nope, this isn't a problem. Nope, this isn't a problem, right? And as soon as you make the assumption that it isn't a problem, it probably is, right? But in any event, it's hard, right? And it takes a lot of times. And this is that operational aspect again that you reflected on before. But what do you think about this? And are there any reflections?
Yeah, I think this goes back to, right, the tools are there, right? But what do we do with those tools? And a lot of times it's, okay, I see that there's potentially an issue, and one, I do have to figure out, do we believe as an organization this is a high, criticality issue or not? But then if it is, how do I go about remediation? Now that I know about it, then what, right? Again, a lot of the tools will tell you, you've got a problem. That's it's very helpful if you see it and if you catch it and if you're logged into all of those tools all the time. Let's be honest, none of us are. But then what, right? How do I then, what are the next steps for me to actually go fix it and avoid it in the future? And that's the next set of challenges of, well, I don't know. Right. I mean, there are people, to your point, that are experts in this, but the vast majority of us are not. And for organizations, it's very hard to find the expert in every one of these tools and every one of the clouds and so on and so forth.
Right.
It's just not a possible
Right.
venture. So
Yep. In my experience, most enterprises are not hiring somebody to just look in the web console, right? And what if you're multi-cloud, right? Now you have to have expertise in Azure, you have to have expertise in Amazon, you have to have expertise in Google and all those things. So it's hard enough to do it for one cloud platform. It's even harder to do it for multiple clouds. And the other point that I thought was relevant is these things are changing constantly, right? The evolution it's fast, right? And so what's available today might not have even been available yesterday. Right? It's happening that fast. So how do you keep up from an expertise standpoint? It's phenomenal, but that's so how will cloud security posture management help me, and how will it enable cloud security? So I want to spend some time on this and dig in a little bit. And I thought I would share some of your wisdom and leverage some of your wisdom to dig in on the CSPM piece.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, CSPM is essentially about locking down the environment to that least privilege or as close to possible, right? We want to make sure that we are, again, continuously, and that's a key component of this. It's not as I deploy, it is a continuous process to make sure that we are looking for any gaps in your security posture within the cloud, right? Specific to CSPM as we're talking about. So it could be something as simple as, right, just unencrypted databases and data storage. It could be poor passwords, lack of multi-factor authentication, right? So a lot of it is simply, are the configuration parameters for all of my services, for all my cloud applications, is everything actually configured properly? You may have servers that are open to the public, right? Again, very simple to do. Right. It's right 0.0.0.0 default setting. If you launch an EC2
I think you shared on one of our former discussions that RDP, open RDP ports, is the #1 attack vector. In 2020. Yeah, very easy to do. Yep.
So, cloud security posture management is really looking at the broader set of potential, again, breach or attack vectors, whether that's, again, vulnerability assessment. We talked about vulnerability scanning in our managed risk discussion last week. Looking at, again, are you hardening your your services? Are you following compliance best practices? And then are you following general best practices through, again, simple things like password policy? Right. Not everybody has enforced password policy. So again, there are some very simple things that can go very, very wrong very quickly. And CSPM is looking at all of those different subcomponents, again, in a very continuous and methodical way, to make sure that we've hardened everything that we possibly can to eliminate every known attack vector, right?
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, like, just even like spinning up a new resource, right? Just identifying resources. So integrating with resource management. Most cloud platforms do a really good job of documenting best practices, by the way. So that's been my experience, that the documentation exists, but somebody would have to look at it in order for it to matter, right? And so, but even being able to identify and discover new resources when they spin up is critical, right? So, keeping an eye on the configuration is part of it, but the resources and identifying those is the other part. I think that's material.
And I think, right, if we look at the management component, right, it's it's cloud security posture management is that the next step level, right? So it's not just figuring out what the gaps are. And we can see that here, right, under the recommendations. It's having the resources, and in our case, right, it's the concierge security team, right, that dedicated named set of resources that not only understand what the gaps are, but will offer you that guided remediation, right? This is exactly what you need to do to fix these set of gaps. Let's prioritize them in terms of risk assessment, what's more critical, what's less critical, right? Versus just yep, here's a list of stuff that's wrong, right? It's a, let's actually work through this with the documentation, with the understanding of what the environment is supposed to look like, so on and so forth. It's moving into managing all of those issues and remediating them. That's just as critical as just finding out what the problems are.
Yep, agreed. So some of the vulnerabilities or the configurations or misconfigurations in this case that are, that are looked for, right? Do you want to elaborate on this at all?
Yeah, and again, this is just a small set of them, and I touched on a few before, right? But as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it's very, very easy to have a service or an EC2 instance exposed to the public internet.
Right.
You would be shocked at how large a percentage of systems are by default exposed, not because anybody was malintentioned, but because it's just simple to do and it's an oversight, and there's not going to be a big honking red alert on your screen if you do it within those portals. They just assume that that's what you wanted to do. Again, least privilege policies we mentioned earlier. You want to have the concept of as locked down as possible unless I need to open something up, right? So let's harden everything as much as we can, right? So provide the least privileged, the smallest amount of privileges that are required for things to function properly, versus starting with everything open, right? It's always easy to open up, right? So to add new, new access layers, but by default, it's usually the other way around. Again, right? Just privilege escalation within assets. And we touched on, poor password policies, or a lot of folks still are not using multi-factor authentication.
Yeah.
Highly recommend that you do if you're not today. Again, talk to Steve, they can help you out with that. But this is just a small high-level view of the simple things that we look for from a vulnerability perspective within the CSPM component.
Yep. And again, I'll just reiterate the multi-factor authentication piece, because just that alone is worth the price of admission, right? Just to know that that's installed or deployed or not missing on any endpoints is so critically important. I thought it would be interesting to kind of dig in on specific public cloud platforms. So Amazon, AWS, Azure, Microsoft, and Google cloud platforms. So do you want to just take some time to go through the specifics of each platform?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, one of the things that we do is we leverage APIs available from all of these services, all of these cloud providers, to get to this data. Again, CloudTrail, CloudWatch, GuardDuty, these are all tools that are present within the Amazon platform. So we're surfacing data that is available, right? It goes back to, it's not the tools problem. We're not deploying tools within AWS, backend infrastructure. What we're doing is via simple CloudFormation deployment, which is again kind of the standard in AWS. We're able to aggregate all of this data into a centralized platform to give you better, broader, comprehensive visibility. And again, we can also tie that with the Arctic Wolf agent living on all of the compute resources that gives us deeper information. So again, going back to Steve mentioned early on, that whole platform, as we're aggregating all of these different pieces of data, it gives you a much broader and holistic picture of what's going on. Yeah. So especially if something happens, we have much more data to understand exactly what transpired. But again, as you can see here, we're tying into CloudTrail for account activity, right? So these are essentially logging engines that feed us all of this data via API, looking at app monitoring and resource monitoring, looking at the firewall logs. But one of the things here is, again, it's not just having the data. One of the values of the platform is we already have the rules in place. You can see here for Amazon, there are over 120 rules out of the box that we've already pre-configured. So as we're pulling all of this data in, there are already security rules set in place to detect any violations or any lack of best practices, so on and so forth. But we can also customize that to every customer, because the reality is everybody is different. And so we offer the best of both worlds. We have a great out of the box setup that then allows you to also customize things for your specific needs. And then again, tie that into all of the various CIS controls and benchmarks with the cloud, the concierge security team members that will work alongside, every customer and really customize that experience, reporting, so on and so forth.
Yep. And I think it is worth noting that, I'll say the big three public cloud providers, Amazon and Microsoft and Google, they have very rich APIs, right? So the amount of data that's available is phenomenal. You can pretty much monitor anything that you want, right? Yeah. But the fact that you have pre-configured alerts and monitors, set up, so there are specific things that you're looking for, day one, I think is paramount, right? So because the first thing you have to understand is, what do I even look for? So how do I even know? Each of the cloud providers says indicators of compromise are this on my platform, right? Or in the cloud in general, right? So you should look for these things, but having it pre-built and pre-configured and being able to do that is phenomenal. And then actually doing it, right? So that's the operationalizing a piece. It's one thing to know about it or have it in documentation, but it's another thing to actually do it every single day. So.
And the thing I'll touch on with all of these as well is, again, we don't have data volume limits, right? So we're not looking at, well, if you're deploying twice as many services tomorrow, your data volume goes up, your ingestion rates go up, your log volume goes up. It's going to be, that's not the focus for us, as you'd see with traditional SIM tools, right? We want to have as much data as we possibly can. So the more we see, the better your security outcomes. So it's a very different approach from that perspective. From a
That's right. It would be counterintuitive to make the cost not equal to the value. That's
And frankly, we've had customers that have used SIM tools before that have basically been in situations where they have to decide, right? Their licensing only allows X amount of data. So, well, I guess I'll turn it off for this.
That's right. I won't include this data.
You kind of just lost,
Yeah, you lost the value. That it's not the cost and the value are not aligned in that model. That's for sure. So I love it. I'm just going to keep moving into G Suite.
Again, very similar thing. You can see, right? We're looking at activity within the G Suite itself, within the applications. But one of the things I'll add to all of these is, outside of the hundreds of the alerts that we've built in, again, is the remediation. Should there be a valid alert and ticket that we surface? And again, keep in mind, we're doing a lot of the analysis behind the scenes on the false positives, the noise, so that we only surface a truly valid, issue or ticket that needs to be remediated. But if we do, right, first of all, that if we call, it's something you probably should pick up on. But we offer that remediation guidance, right? So we don't just open a ticket and say, you've got, you need to go fix such and such. It's, let's work on it together. Let's give you the remediation guidance, the step-by-step. Let us help you fix this, because at the end of the day, our number one priority is to make sure that all of these issues go away, not to say, yes, we found something, here's the ticket, and we're off to the next thing.
Yep.
We're not done until you're safe.
Yep, and I think that's a great point, Dimitri. And it's probably worth noting, this is one of the reasons why I think that we work well together, right? So we have expertise, and we enjoy working with your team. We know what we're talking about and what we're doing, and a lot of times we have to do the investigation ourselves, and we get a lot of information, but actually remediating the vulnerabilities is what lowers the risk. And so when we are able to put a package in place, we know that risk is going to be lowered, because we absolutely know with certainty that the vulnerability remediation is going to happen, right? So it's pretty cool from that perspective. But to your point, having somebody manage risk is ensuring that remediation is getting done, and that's one of the things that we appreciate about this. So this relationship, Office 365, and I think it's important to include. It's not just about Azure platform; it's about cloud in general. And there's a lot of monitoring in place for Office 365 implementations, which a lot of customers have moved to.
Right. It's again, it's not just cloud, right? This is also SaaS, right? So whether it's Office 365, whether it's Box that we've talked about before, Salesforce, right? It's looking at not just your applications in Amazon or Azure, but it's looking at cloud-based applications that you might be using, because again, there could be you may have Office 365 with sensitive data. It's all in the cloud in SaaS, and if somebody has access to the wrong set of data, there's a lot of data in spreadsheets for companies with some really sensitive information. That's a problem, right? So it's not just looking at cloud in terms of we want to protect your EC2 instances or your Azure deployments. We want to make sure that all of your cloud-based, right, or SaaS applications are also protected as well.
Yep, understood. I keep moving through this. I put a couple of pieces of material in here, and again, this isn't about going through every bullet item, but just to understand the amount of things that are being monitored. Do you want to elaborate at all on this? And
I think the simplest way to look at this is a really large list, and there's more that keeps getting added by the cloud providers, and then obviously we add it to our support list. But frankly, I couldn't tell you what every one of these things are, right? And most people cannot, unless they are, right, hands down experts in these services. And so again, it becomes a really big challenge to maintain support as companies start using more and more of these services that become available. How do you know, and how do you make sure that you're following the right best practice, right? There's a 130-page guide just for S3 buckets. Imagine when you start getting into Kubernetes, right? I've dealt with that part of the world. It is complicated. There's a lot of things that could go wrong. And so really the way to look at this is there's a lot that could go wrong in general across all these deployments.
It's worth making the point that technologies like Kubernetes and the whole DevOps space is about fast IT, and it's about getting things done faster.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that we're talking about operationally can easily be perceived as slowing down the process, right? And if you have to take the time to do it right, it will slow down the process. So what's interesting, and this is one of the challenges we talk about this internally a lot, how do we do it right and fast at the same time, right? And automation, having partners like Arctic Wolf to leverage the things that you do really, really well is a key part of that, right? And automating certain tasks is a key part of that, right? So again, if I go back to a few slides, to having those pre-built rules in place already, so implementation becomes a snap, right? And then you have a whole team of people on the SOC side, on the managed SOC side, that are watching for indicators of compromise in that environment immediately. So it really helps maintain the speed that business is moving at, and still have the checks and balances in place to make sure that we're doing things right and meeting compliance requirements and all those other things. Same thing for Azure. Again, probably not a whole lot to add here. It's a different set of things, but I think one of the things that really resonated for me as I start trying to get my arms around the complexity of all these things is multiple cloud platforms mean multiple sets of expertise, quite honestly, right? Everybody does it their way. Microsoft does it their way, Amazon does it their way, Google does it their way, and those kind of things. So that single pane of glass view and automation around monitoring and throwing alerts and things like that, and filtering all the false positives, it just becomes invaluable when you think about the complexity, how exponentially it increases and those kind of things. So that was my key learning. I love this view because cloud really comes in one of three forms, right? It's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. And maybe you can speak a little bit to how we address those three areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think we predominantly see CSPM more focused on the IS side. But again, as we touched on earlier, when we look at SaaS-based platforms, whether that's Office 365, whether that's Box, Salesforce, et cetera, those are things that we're not controlling the back-end infrastructure and the applications themselves, but that doesn't mean that there's not security exposure. And so CSPM does have a really strong still requirement in SaaS to make sure that even from a simple perspective of who's trying to access our SaaS services, right? If I've got somebody accessing Salesforce from a known region of the world that we know nobody should be accessing from, or from a known set of IPs, yes, right, they're not trying to hack the back end. That's Salesforce's security issue, going back to responsibilities. But if they are trying to gain access to my instance, and maybe that's an account takeover issue, right? That's now my problem. That's my application. That's my data. And so that's, again, there should be a huge focus on making sure that SaaS-based applications are still protected via, again, this concept of cloud security posture management. Same thing with PaaS, right? We're not managing necessarily we're getting the full platform, but we're still accessing it. So we want to make sure that we are looking at best practices from our organizational, again, whether that's MFA and password policy or data exfiltration, like we still are responsible for securing the data itself and how it gets accessed. So CSPM, while it's predominantly, lives in the IS space, it definitely touches all three of these components, albeit in slightly different ways. But security is not isolated to just this one set of tools or applications and infrastructure. If you're using it, right, if you're touching that data, you really need to make sure that it's secured. That's really what it's going to boil down to, and that's where we come in with a full broad set of capabilities.
Yep. Yeah, what really resonated with me was the platform as a service, the PaaS stuff, right? So we have enterprises that are, I'll say, moving. It seems like the initial shift to the cloud was pick up what you had in a physical environment, move it into the cloud, which was infrastructure as a service, right? Everybody was setting up VMs in the cloud. And now more often people are trying to leverage the platform as a service for economics and for offloading some of that responsibility, right? So the cloud provider has to patch the platform as a service environment, if you will, right? So there's, theoretically, there's no responsibility from that perspective, but to your point, you're still responsible for security of the data, but you still manage, and this cloud security platform management, posture management function still looks at the resource logs, right? And acquires that data. And so if somebody spins up a new PaaS resource, for example, it's identified, right? So that discovery of assets, that's a huge part, right? So we have a saying about you can't secure what you don't know about, so you have 0% chance of securing things you don't even know exist. Right? So you have to know they exist. So I think it's material from that perspective. We'll keep moving through some of this. I think that, this is probably, an elaboration on the things that we've already talked about. Is there anything that you would add from this slide?
No, I think the cloud inventory reporting component is what you just touched on as well, right? It's you need to know what you're running, right? It's to your point. If as cloud environments get bigger and as simple as it is for somebody in the organization to deploy, especially if we haven't gone through and hardened everything already, this is a very simple way to just get exposure to who's running what. What do I even have that's we've all heard the horror stories of the AWS bill at the end of the month skyrocketing by 1,000% because somebody spun up something they shouldn't have, right? It doesn't have to be an external threat. It could be just somebody doing something they shouldn't have internally. And unfortunately, right, we've had customers that have gone through that and we've helped them mitigate that impact, but things happen, right? They're bad employees, disgruntled employees that do bad things sometimes. So even something as simple as inventory reporting can be a very critical component to that security posture.
Yep, agreed. And it's worth making the point that the access controls, and you talked about a little bit about this before, but they apply regardless, right? If it's in the cloud platform. So if it's an Azure platform as a service or PaaS item, right? The access controls are the same. You still log into the subscription and those kind of things, and that's all being monitored. So that's it's relevant from that perspective. So key features about the cloud security platform posture management.
So we talked about a lot of things that we look for, right? This is, I mean, at a high level, these are the gaps that we're closing, right? So all of the things that we talked about that could be potential problems, they're not just problems that we're aware of, they're problems that we're actively fixing with you and for you to make sure that you have a truly hardened, secure environment. Again, continuously, not just, you know, once a month or, you know, once a quarter. This is a constant, continuous hardening approach.
Yep. Very cool. And then just to kind of summarize, I guess, the CSPM piece.
Yeah, again, we've talked a lot about tools having data, but not really being able to make sense of it. Part of the value of this platform and what the Arctic Wolf CSTs are doing is that we are taking all this data and obviously surfacing anything that needs to be dealt with immediately, but we also have all of these reports that are continuously published and available and can be requested ad hoc. But this gives you a lot of detail, everything from just a high level, right? I want to see things broken down by availability zones or regions, to the nitty-gritty details of exactly what instance has what problem and so on and so forth. So we take that data and we make sense of it for you and present it in an actually easy to consume model versus just an overwhelmed model.
Yep. Yeah, and again, it's worth noting that it can be any one of the big three cloud platforms, and this information can be generated. So it's worth making the point that the CSPM feature, if you will, is part of the managed risk platform. So we focused on managed risk on the last webinar, and we actually used this slide on here, but I wanted to pull it up just to really focus or zero in on that cloud scanning and cloud monitoring piece. Right. So do you have any comments about like how the architecture, applies in this case?
Yeah, again, I think, right, you want to have the whole platform. If you want full end-to-end security, you want to make sure that you're doing both the, kind of the traditional managed risk via just the vulnerability scanning, as well as leveraging all of the CSPM capabilities. Again, our agents will tie into the APIs for the various cloud providers, so we can pull that data, ingest it, parse it, analyze it, report, so on and so forth. But again, you can see that from an overall managed risk perspective, there is a very broad set of functions that you really need to cover to have that full security across your environment. And you're going to see an overlap within cloud environments of I'll call it the generic managed risk, as well as some of the CSPM topics that we talked about. So you really need to look at both aspects of it for a full solution.
Yep. And for me, what I think is worth noting is that, like, if it is a VM, like a infrastructure as a service, there'll be an agent on it, right? So,
yep.
and so all of that, you'll get the data within that VM, right, within that container. And so you'll manage those vulnerabilities. They'll show up on the managed risk report that way. But the cloud architecture itself, right, and how it's configured is monitored by the cloud monitoring piece. And so it'll count the resource, but the vulnerability management, a lot of it will come from the VM itself, but the cloud configuration piece will be continuously monitored as well, which is
correct.
Is material. So that's I think that's a good overview of the CSPM piece. And I wanted to close with just kind of revisiting the whole solution, right? And so I'll toggle through a bunch of these things because most of these slides we've shown before, but they're worth bringing back up. Again, our ASMGi's MDR MSOC Plus program is really all of these things that we've talked about from an Arctic Wolf perspective, plus some additional things like managing that whole process and having the expertise on the table. What our observation is a lot of customers don't have the headcount or the expertise, one or the other or both of those to get these things done, right? So our premise around ONEteam is we'll do it for you. You should get all the benefits of having these features and functionality without the burden of actually having to do it. And so what I appreciate, Dimitri, about what Arctic Wolf is doing is we have a really good working relationship, and our experts in both on the incident response side and the vulnerability management side, and even onboarding new customers, just work really well together. And so that's really cool, and just have so much information available to these things. And if we need to have a discussion, we just have a discussion about about that. So it's really cool from that perspective. I show this slide every time, and I talk about the shift in thinking required to really get to this total solution perspective. But I won't spend any time on this, but program plus technology plus operations. We've said it before. We'll continue to say this because I think it's so material, and the operations get left off a lot of times because of resource requirements or headcount or expertise requirements. So I'll get to that tomorrow, or I'll get to that next week, and it ends up being 6 months later when you look at those things. The MDR MSOC Plus program in general includes all of the things that we've talked about in all three of these webinars, right? The Security Operations Center, the MDR piece, which is critically important, right? Having that 24/7 monitoring of indicators of compromise violations going on is critical. Manage risk, which we've talked about a little bit today, and we spent last week on in the cloud monitoring piece, right? But in addition to that, the deep dive on the incident response and doing those things, and again, it's worth making the point that Arctic Wolf, from an incident response standpoint, is doing a lot of the like even automating the isolation of an endpoint or those kind of things. Arctic Wolf is doing a lot of those things and collecting information and doing the advisory services, but we'll go further than that, right? And actually do the incident response, do the cleanup, do the data preservation, do the final report, the incident reporting, do all of those things, including forensics and investigative services and various different things. And on the vulnerability management side, I think it's worth pointing out from a package standpoint that that we leverage all of the information that Arctic Wolf pulls together and do the remediation. So it's a key point from that perspective. I love this slide, and we've talked about it before, but the active, proactive, reactive piece is so revealing, and I think it really tells the story well. Is there anything that you want to talk about, Dimitri, as it relates to this?
Just that and this is what we've covered before as well. I think most times people focus on the proactive and reactive and really forget the active component.
Yeah.
You really, again, right, you've got to have that whole loop. You can't just have 2 out of 3. You have to have that as part of the overall solution. If you don't, you're really falling short on the overall security, whether you call it a security journey or security posture, but at the end of the day, you're leaving yourself unprotected if you don't implement that active component.
Yeah. Well, Capital One is a good example of that, right? So there you go.
As unfortunately, there are so many others.
Yes, and so many others. Yep. This slide we talked about last time as well, but I wanted to bring it back because it's so relevant. This curve, the bottom curve around doing continuous vulnerability management is so critical, and it's aspirational, right? It's the desired state. It's the future state, if you will. It's the state everybody wants to get to. And the point I want to make about the top curve is that if you do remediation, then you accumulate some vulnerabilities, and you scan for them and point them out, and then you do some remediation. And so your number of vulnerabilities goes down. And then over time, it goes back up again. And then you do another scan and you kick off another cycle of remediation, and it goes down, but then it goes back up, and those kind of things. And the point that I want to make is that if you don't actively do that remediation piece, it just keeps going up, right? So neither of these are ideal, quite honestly. This bottom curve, the continuous one, is the one that you want. And you get it when you are continuously identifying vulnerabilities and managing them and remediating those vulnerabilities. So what's worth noting is that as part of this program, like we do a client onboarding, and all of the agents get put in place, and the scanners and all of those things. And then all of a sudden there's a period of awakening, right? Where you're saying like, oh no, I have all these vulnerabilities to deal with. What's going on? So we create a get well plan so that everybody, right at the get-go is on the same page, right? This is what the vulnerability and your security posture looks like. This is what we're going to do to get you to a steady state, if you will. It's a plan. It's a get well plan. And then once we get you to that steady state, never deviate from that, right? Never get back to that thing. And so that really equates to the bottom curve. And I think that's an ideal place to get to. One of the things that I want to point out is that risk, and this is true 100% of the time, risk equals likelihood times impact. And that anybody who's in risk probably knows that equation like the back of their hand. But there are certain ways that we can, if you want to lower your risk, you either lower the likelihood or lower the impact. And the thing that I try to point out about this package is that we have an opportunity to lower both of those. And so I just wanted to point out a little bit about how we do that, right? So how do we lower the likelihood? Remediating the vulnerabilities, and we've shared these stats before, but 99% of all attacks are on known vulnerabilities. So if you remediate the vulnerabilities, you take 99% of the attack surface off the table right out of the gate. I think that's huge. 0 times anything is 0, right? So the risk goes to 0 if the likelihood goes to 0. If you remediate like RDP, like you mentioned earlier, Dimitri, I think, right? So if you close those gaps, if you do that remediation, then it's not attackable, it's not exploitable. And there you have it, likelihood equals 0. Also, by identifying the vulnerabilities continuously across all, one of the things I love about Arctic Wolf is the breadth of visibility and the breadth of service that's included, but it's external vulnerability assessment. And from the internal side, it's host base that are, agents basically authenticated, right? It's also cloud, it's also network visibility. So if there are things you can't put an agent on, like an IoT device or something like that, you still see the network traffic and issue vulnerabilities for that. So it's phenomenal from that perspective. And I just, impact. So our priorities from a MDR MSOC Plus standpoint are first to avoid attacks altogether, right? And you do that by lowering the likelihood, hopefully to 0. But if we can't do that, you're good. If you get attacked anyway, somebody compromises your network, then we want to minimize the impact, right? We want to make that number smaller. We do that by identifying intruders quickly. I have countless examples of this. As do you, I'm sure, but identifying them quickly anywhere on your network. So this is the key, right? So you use all of these tools that we've talked about, but network traffic analysis and agents and all of these things to identify indicators of compromise and say, hey, there's a problem here, user behavior analytics, all that stuff, right? So the longer an intruder stays on your network, so this is a point I always try to make, the more time they have to figure out how to do damage, right? And so that's not a good thing. Identifying configuration issues in the cloud is huge, as we saw today. Containment of the incident and automating that function, right? So if I click on a link on my laptop, you can automate it from the rest of the network. No traffic can go out to a central command center or command and control center or anything like that. And can infect other devices on the network and those kind of things. So automatic containment and containment of incident or of assets, I think, is cool. And then, practicing the incident response. And this is one of the things that we include with the incident response piece of the MDR MSOC Plus service is actually doing tabletop exercises. And I can't emphasize enough that, you know, during an incident is not the time to figure out like who you're going to call, right? Just practice it and have a well-articulated plan and really know who's responsible for what and who's going to do what, who's going to make the call, who are you going to call, and those kind of things. So anything to add to this part of it, Dimitri?
No, I think you hit that nail on the head. It's great.
Awesome. So key takeaways, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the breadth of visibility is phenomenal, and I can't emphasize enough how important that is. If you miss one of these things to look at, then that's going to be the place that gets breached, right? So it's to lower risk, you have to remediate the vulnerabilities. 24/7 eyes on glass is critical. You know, just watching the environment 24/7, I think is paramount. Having a single pane of glass for all the cyber risks. And in the cloud, you know, it's just hard. It's just hard. I can't imagine having to log into management consoles individually and manage risk that way, right? And practicing cyber incident responses. So we had a couple of questions come in. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those. And that's one of the questions was, does ASMGi do the remediation based on the Arctic Wolf concierge service? So I'll just jump on that, Dimitri, and then you can chime in if you want to. But we leveraged your security concierge service, and they're a tremendous asset in that. But we've been doing remediation services for years, and so we do it for a lot of enterprises, some of them global in nature. So we're very good at the investigation and, you know, how do you remediate things? But so it's great to have visibility into that. And when your team escalates an incident, we're on it. But we have access to all of that stuff in the risk portal, right? And so we're addressing that and building a get well plan that's really commensurate with the types of vulnerabilities and you know, how long is it going to take to get to a steady state in remediation and those kind of things. So we definitely leverage the concierge service. The other point that I'll make is that the concierge service is not going to hands on the keyboard remediate the vulnerabilities, but the advice is there. So giving advisory services about how do you do it, you know, install this patch or, you know, make this registry entering or the registry entry or those kind of things is certainly a piece of that. Anything to add to that?
No, I think again we're going to provide the remediation guidance, but you know, Arctic Wolf, the CSTs are not going to be the hands-on keyboard. So that's again where we look for the partnership.
Yeah.
For those that need it, right? Yep.
Another question I had is, does this solution work for IaaS, infrastructure as a service, PaaS, platform as a service, and SaaS, SaaS as a service? And we did address that in the webinar. So anything to add to that response, Dimitri?
No, it just right, because as we talked about, there are different components in each that we want to look at. But if you're using any of them, you need to be securing
Yep.
all of them.
Yep. And I would say if there's a specific SaaS application, for example, let's have a conversation, because there are certain things that you already have integrated into your platform, and there are certain things that are on the roadmap, and there are certain things that you're not going to do. So, like for example, there are thousands of SaaS applications, right? It's unreasonable to assume that all of them would be integrated, fully integrated. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't address vulnerabilities. So I think it's a conversation and figuring out, like, how do we best accomplish what needs to be accomplished and those kind of things. And I think that's certainly something we can do. So there was a question. We already use Qualys for vulnerability management. How do we leverage this solution? Any input on that?
Well, can you reread that?
We already use Qualys for vulnerability management. How do we leverage this solution?
So you can leverage them in tandem. You don't have to, right? So again, a lot of the vulnerability scanning solutions, they're good tools, but again, they look at just one part of the problem. So obviously, you know, managed risk from Arctic Wolf is not just vulnerability scanning. it's a much broader set of functions. But even on the vulnerability side, again, what we're focused on is the continual scanning and remediation. So again, we have some customers that choose to continue, to run those tools in tandem. Others that don't and just leverage our platform. It will depend on the specifics of each environment, and we'd be more than happy to have that conversation.
Yeah.
But again, I'd say the bigger thing is it's not just about vulnerability scanning. That's critical, but there's so much more that you need to look at beyond just that.
Yep. Agreed. And normally how I address this question is that nobody ever validates, like if you have a vulnerability scanner, how do you know it's finding all the vulnerabilities, right? So if you already have a scanner, put the service in place and just compare the vulnerabilities found by this method and the vulnerabilities found by this method. And if they're the same, then you can throw one of them out, right? Not do one of them. So just keep one. If one is more than the other, then it can drive some really good Q&A and some really good dialogue. Yeah. I think around that. So validation is one of the points, but we're a big fan of leveraging investment. If you've already made an investment in the technology and you're comfortable with it and you're using it, there's no reason to transition unless there is a reason, right? So, but we should have a conversation about that. One last question I want to get to. I know we're way over on time, but I'm wondering if you have any idea how much your services would lower the premiums from an insurance policy. The market seems to be changing, right? And that I'll hand that off to you first, Dimitri.
Yes. So I don't have the specific numbers per se, and I think it'll vary customer, to organization, from one organization to the next. I can tell you that, we just worked with an organization that was looking at CMMC compliance, for example, and without our service in place, they were looking, I think their score was like 40 something, low 40s, just by implementing the core basics of Arctic Wolf. They jumped to around 90 or something, right? So before any customization. So I think it'll depend on every specific situation, what the organization is and what, who their provider is. But absolutely, if we're able to show, and we can do that very quickly and easily, that we're taking an organization from high security risk to extremely low security risk, that should lead to a reduction in those premiums. Right. What that specific reduction is, I think will vary. So and it depends. It's a little hard to tell.
Yeah, it depends a lot. So we've had a lot of these discussions with insurance companies, and the market is definitely changing. In fact, even today with the amount of ransomware that's going on, like a lot of insurance providers are saying, they're like pay ransom. Hey, hold on a second, this is costing us a lot of money, right? And so they're changing the dynamics around that and putting more emphasis on really evaluation. The insurance industry, they're technically professional risk takers, right? So they should really understand the risk. But as it relates to cyber, historically, I don't think there's been a good understanding of the risk. And so the feedback that we've gotten from the insurance industry historically has been there isn't really an impact on the premiums. Today, there is more of an impact, but compliance, to your point that you went to on the CMMC thing, is a big piece of this, right? Who are you doing business with? Who is your market? What kind of data do you have? I think all of these things play into it, as well as who's underwriting the insurance policy, right? But in general, from an incident response, and this is a question that I've gotten in the past, like, our insurance company absolutely requires that they do incident response. That's so if anybody else does anything, then our policy is voided, right? We've encountered those situations often, and usually a conversation with the insurance company addresses that. But I maintain that most incident responders or first responders to cyber incidents, they know nothing when they come in, right? Not what happened, not what type of malware or ransomware it is, or anything, how much data was impacted, how many systems, and those kind of things. We're in a position to offer so much information to make that workload so much smaller that it's huge. So the insurance companies really stand to benefit a lot from having a service like this in place. And I am 100% certain that we can lower the risk of our customers with a program like this. So that's that. I think insurance companies are more apt to address this on an ongoing basis. And we're way over on time. I really appreciate everybody sticking around, including you, Dimitri. It's been a lot of fun going through this series. We have a couple of questions I didn't get to, but I want to be respectful and cut it off here, and we'll try to make sure that we send those out as well. But thank you, everybody. And if you have additional questions, please send them via email, or just reach out and contact us, and we'll follow up as well. So thanks, Dimitri, again for your time and your wisdom. I appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.